Primitive War, a novel by Ethan Pettis. Read by Wayne June. Author's dedication. In memory of Michael Crichton. Dedicated to my mother and father. Prologue. September 23, 1968. Vietnam's natural splendor was plagued by war. Peaceful jungles were transformed into hellish labyrinths where soldiers lost their minds and lives to horrific firefights. Fear and paranoia pulled apart the threads of human morality. The Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army's biggest push against American forces in southern Vietnam, set entire cities ablaze. Massacres were committed every day by American forces and Viet Cong alike. Many miles north of this conflict, beyond the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam, lay an ancient jungle valley seemingly untouched by the violence. An ocean of thick treetop canopy blanketed the rolling hills within the valley. A slithering black river bisected the floodplains of the basin and reflected the luminous moon on a starless night. Heavy clouds slumped over the cragged mountain peaks and drifted down the slopes. War drums shook the air, warning the jungle of an approaching thunderstorm. Beneath the canopy, lost amongst the countless leviathan trunks of kapok and durian trees, a lone soldier named Kendrick Anderson ran for his life. Kendrick clawed madly through the dripping wet thickets, his pale face strained with panic. The darkness consumed everything beneath the multi-layered canopy. Kendrick was blind, stumbling over creeping roots and low-slung vines. The broad leaves of banana trees slapped his face like frigid hands. His boots caught on a submerged log, and he fell face first into a carpet of rotting plant matter and tree bark. He dragged himself through the soil and climbed to his feet, whimpering like a beaten dog. How long had he been lost in this valley? It had only been a week, and each day felt like a separate lifetime, filled with harrowing new challenges to test his ability to survive. He was a member of the Green Beret, one of the U.S. Army's masters of counter-guerrilla warfare. But the valley proved to be too much for him. He was lucky to be alive and somewhat sane. The rest of his platoon hadn't been so fortunate. When Kendrick's platoon had first marched into this obscure valley, they had been so sure of themselves. They thought their mission was just another walk through the park, evading Viet Cong and dangerous wildlife. That was until the first of his 12-man platoon had died. The first man to die was taken at night. Kendrick had awoken to find his friend Maynard missing in action. All he could find left of his squad mate was a few ragged bits of skin and a trail of blood leading deeper into the wilderness. It happened to another man the following night, and again the night after that. Sometimes they were taken while they slept. Other times, during patrols, Kendrick would be walking with his platoon, and when he looked over his shoulder, another one of his fellow soldiers would be missing, without a sound or sign of what had happened. They started to suspect that they were being followed by a man-eater, like a tiger or an Asiatic black bear. They all knew the legends, the stories passed among soldiers while eating their rations around a fire. The Vietnamese spoke of demons that haunted the jungle, abducting children from unsuspecting villages. Kendrick thought it made sense that vengeful demons would try their hand at abducting young Americans. His friends laughed at him for thinking so, but that was until they saw their killer late one night. The creature was something Kendrick had never seen before, and wished to never see again. It was fast, quiet, and nearly impossible to spot amongst the foliage. There were 4 of the creatures in total. Despite the platoon's best efforts to fight back, the predators were too vicious and cunning. During the first encounter, 3 of Kendrick's squad mates had been slaughtered. He could still hear bones cracking, the wet rip of organs being torn from his screaming friends. Kendrick barely slept after the attack. It didn't take long for Kendrick's squad to fall apart. Somebody lost the radio during the attack, and another man lost his rifle and rucksack. They became lost within a maddeningly endless jungle, disconnected from their only chance of escape. 2 more men were taken the following night. Only Kendrick and 2 others were left. They had to continue pushing north in an attempt to complete their clandestine mission. The deeper they ventured into the valley, the more unnatural the jungle seemed to become. Hidden beasts howled in the night. Immense creatures, as big as planes, flew through the sky. They even discovered the skull of an elephant that had been crushed by the jaws of a powerful behemoth. One morning, Kendrick discovered the body of one of his last remaining squad mates outside of their campsite. The young man's throat had been torn open, and his stomach was eviscerated. Kendrick hadn't heard a thing. He had slept through the attack. His other friend, his only other remaining squad mate, committed suicide shortly thereafter. And now, Kendrick was alone, running for his life through the forest without any semblance of a plan or a hope for survival. He knew he was being hunted. Death lurked in every shifting shadow, hidden within the subtlest sound of a twig breaking or the rustling of leaves. He couldn't see or hear the creatures, but he knew they were there. Kendrick could feel their cold eyes crawling over his bruised, beaten body. They were probably licking their teeth in anticipation, waiting for the perfect moment to tear into him while he was alive and screaming. But he wouldn't let them. God, no, he wouldn't let that happen. A thunderclap shook the trees, and almost immediately a wave of heavy rainfall crashed through the canopy. The storm overwhelmed Kendrick's senses. He squinted as rain packed his eyes. The drone of the pattering rain filled his ears. He stumbled through the undergrowth, his hands held before him to keep from running into a tree trunk. As Kendrick walked, he noticed the trees were becoming more spacious and the undergrowth was shrinking back. Based on his training, he knew that he was approaching a waterway. If he found the river or a stream, he could follow the current towards the southern end of the valley, where his commanding officer, General Jericho, had a small military base. Kendrick felt a smile tremble on his lips. Maybe he was going to make it out alive. There was a flash of lightning. Everything was painted in white light and traced with shadow. In that brief instant, he saw the horrifying outline of a creature gliding through the undergrowth like an apparition. Thunder clapped above his head, and the jungle was thrown back into darkness. Kendrick stood frozen in the torrential downpour. He stared wide-eyed into the abyss, and slowly sank to his knees. It was out there, circling him. He dimly hoped that it couldn't see or smell him in the rain. Maybe it was just as blind as he was. And then, through the constant thrum of rain, he heard it. Heavy breathing, slowly coming closer. Kendrick jumped to his feet and sprinted through the forest, weaving around tree trunks, jumping over logs and rocks. His boot fell off and he slowed down, wincing with each step. Twigs and stones tore apart the tender flesh of his rotted foot. Kendrick staggered, shaking beneath the icy needles of rain, propelled by his surging adrenaline. He heard the rain's relentless assault against the surface of the river. He was getting closer to escape. Somewhere his predator was watching. He could feel it. Kendrick's bare foot slipped through the mud and he fell forward with a wet smack. His sense of fight or flight possessed him. He dug his hands into the marshy turf and dragged himself forward through the thick stalks and stems of swamp vegetation. Kendrick pulled himself over a slope and he slid into the frigid, fetid water. The cold shocked him, and he thrust his head up out of the water, panting and shivering. There was a flash of lightning, and he saw spider-legged mangrove trees surrounding him. The jungle seemed empty, devoid of life. That meant it was nearby. Kendrick knew he couldn't run anymore. Each breath he took burned through his lungs. His body was numb from the cold, and his heart struggled to keep the thick blood pumping in his veins. It was time to hide. He cautiously waded to the chest-deep water towards the mangroves. Kendrick crawled into a mangrove's cage of roots and peered out at the black mirror of the water's surface. It appeared he had fallen into a pond. His only chance at escape had been a pipe dream. All he had left to do was sit and wait, shivering and gripped by terror. Through the roaring storm, Kendrick could hear footsteps slowly padding around the water's edge. Each footstep was carefully placed, methodical and silent. He heard the predator sniffing the air, followed by a long, low growl. Leaves brushed softly against feathers and leathery skin. The creature was circling the pond, trying to locate Kendrick in the storm. Kendrick carefully tucked himself further back into the mangrove's den and stared at the water's dappled surface. He held his breath until his lungs felt sucked dry. There was a flash of lightning, and he saw the silhouette of the creature reflected on the water's surface. It was heavily distorted, but Kendrick could clearly see the outline of the animal's body. It was taller than a man, with a straight tail and muscular limbs. The creature raised its long snout, sniffing the air. The hooked claws flicked in anticipation. The creature's jaws parted into a toothy, rumbling snarl. It was only 10 feet away. Kendrick trembled uncontrollably. Tears were lost with the rain on his face. A pitiful cry crawled from his lips like a worm, and he clasped his hands over his mouth to keep quiet. Urine flowed freely between his legs. Kendrick could hear the footsteps approaching, slowly. The creature was taking its time. It knew that he had nowhere left to run. Kendrick's eyes began to adjust to the darkness. He saw the muscular legs of the creature standing before him. The sickle-shaped claws flexed and dug into the earth. Kendrick was petrified with fear. He could no longer think or comprehend his reality. He could only watch as the creature crouched in front of him and stared back with cold, calculating eyes. The creature spread its arms around the mangrove roots, cloaking the den with feathers. Its talons scraped against the root bark. One last embrace to ensure there would be no escape. The creature's eyes glowed yellow in the darkness. The feathers muffled the sound of the storm. Kendrick could only hear his own whimpering and the slow, steady breathing of the animal. It was so dark that he could barely see the jaws of the creature opening to reveal serrated teeth. The animal's hot breath, rancid with decay, washed over him. Kendrick could feel a desperate plea catch in his throat. "Please." The creature's head shot forward, and it snatched Kendrick's throat in its jaws. The animal shook him violently side to side, ripping the flesh of his neck like a tissue. Hot blood ran down Kendrick's torso, and the creature let go of him. Kendrick fell backwards, screaming, and a fiery pain flared through his body as talons sliced his stomach open. The creature was savage, growling and indifferent, while Kendrick shrieked and pounded its snout with his fists. In his last fleeting moment of consciousness, Kendrick watched as the creature buried its snout into his abdomen and tugged out coils of intestine. The last thing he felt was his own horrendous death rattle boring through the ragged holes in his throat. This was not the war he knew. You've been listening to Primitive War, written by Ethan Pettis. Read for you by Wayne June. Copyright 2017 by Ethan Pettis. Production copyright 2020 by Ethan Pettis.